March 23, 1945. Imagine the final, desperate line of defense for an entire nation, a natural fortress deemed impassable for 2 millennia. Now imagine a fleet of trucks simply driving across it. Stay with us, because on March 23, 1945, the German High Command was about to witness a catastrophic failure of military intelligence and a revolution in warfare. They had prepared for a vicious battle to hold the Rhine River, expecting the Allies to spend days constructing vulnerable pontoon bridges under concentrated artillery fire. What they never conceived of was a mass-produced, 6-wheeled industrial marvel that would turn their mighty 1,300-foot-wide river into an overnight American highway, crushing the morale of their last remaining combat units. This is the unbelievable true story of the DWK Amphibious truck, a vehicle so revolutionary it invalidated every established rule of river warfare, leading captured German officers to stare in stunned, silent disbelief as they realized the war they had been fighting was already over. At precisely 2100 hours on the evening of March 23, 1945, near Wesel, Germany, the final defense of the Third Reich was set to begin. Lieutenant Wilhelm Steinberg of the German Army, observing the western bank of the Rhine, had been assured by his engineers and commanders that the river was their shield. The plan was simple: the immense width of the river, coupled with the fierce 10-knot currents, made any conventional crossing impossible without days of specialized visible engineering work. German 88mm guns were pre-registered on every potential bridge construction point. The expected sequence was a tedious, vulnerable process: small infantry units in slow assault boats, the establishment of small, fragile bridgeheads, and finally, the slow, exposed construction of fixed bridges. This would have given the German defenders 48 to 72 hours to launch deadly counterattacks. The Wehrmacht assumed they knew the rigid laws of river warfare, but they had fundamentally misjudged the core strength of their enemy: American industrial ingenuity and pragmatic innovation. The truth lay with the 2,000 men of the British 51st Highland Division's 7th Battalion, the Black Watch, who were preparing to enter the water. They were not boarding small, vulnerable boats. They were climbing into boat-shaped trucks, designated DUKW. German intelligence analysts, in a failure of strategic foresight, almost unthinkable at this late stage of the war, had completely misclassified these vehicles. Reports from the Normandy and Italian campaigns mentioned the DUKW, but commanders dismissed them as merely specialized landing craft, fit only for coastal operations and irrelevant to the grand scale of river warfare. They were filed away as technical curiosities, a symbol of American logistical extravagance, like the famous ice cream ships. The Wehrmacht, operating under the assumption of their own material shortages, wildly underestimated American capacity. One German intelligence report, later recovered, estimated the entire European theater contained perhaps 100 of these swimming trucks. The reality was a staggering 21,147 DUKWs manufactured by General Motors, with thousands already operating in Europe, organized into dedicated, specialized amphibious truck companies by March 1945. The rapid development of the DUKW itself speaks to the American focus on practical problem-solving. The concept was born in April 1942, after a simple Coast Guard incident where a boat ran aground and conventional vehicles could not reach it. Yacht designer Rod Stevens, Jr. worked with the Ford Motor Company, which initially declined the project, but General Motors quickly adopted the design. The first prototype, marrying a standard GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck chassis to a watertight hull, rolled off the assembly line in just 38 days. The DUKW's ability to transition from water to land without pausing was its strategic genius. It possessed two key technological secrets: a dedicated propeller driven by the main transmission and the revolutionary central tire inflation system, or CTIS, which allowed the driver to inflate or deflate the tires on the move. This meant the DUKW could float across the river, then immediately lower its tire pressure to walk across mud, soft sand, and slippery riverbanks, enabling it to drive directly into the dense terrain of the German defenses. The total cost for this war-winning capability was roughly the equivalent of 7 standard Jeeps. In March 1945, the German defenses, spearheaded by General Alfred Schlemm's decimated 1st Parachute Army, were a hollow shell reinforced by the elderly and youthful units of the Volkssturm. Yet they were armed with doctrine. They believed that the required slow, sequential phases of a traditional river assault, infantry crossing, small bridgehead, main bridging, would give them the time necessary to crush the incursion. They were counting on that 48 to 72-hour window to organize a decisive counterattack. That window was about to be obliterated. Unbeknownst to them, the Allied forces had gathered the largest fleet of amphibious vehicles in history. Hundreds of DUKWs, many armored and mounted with 50-caliber machine guns, were secretly staged and concealed near the crossing points. This was not a logistical novelty. The DUKW was the spearhead. Each amphibious truck was slated to carry a full infantry squad across the Rhine, drive up the eastern bank, and drop its troops miles inland, effectively bypassing all German strongpoints prepared to defend the river's immediate edge. Captain James Mitchell of the 819th Amphibious Truck Company recounted the mission's audacity. They were told they would be using DUKWs as the primary assault vehicle for a major river crossing, something completely unprecedented.
At 1700 hours on March 23, 1945, a stunning barrage erupted as over 4,000 Allied guns unleashed a terrifying 4-hour bombardment. German observers reported the opposite bank was literally boiling under the weight of the shelling. Under this deafening cover and the veil of night, the first DUKWs slipped into the Rhine at 2100 hours. The strong current proved difficult, sweeping some vehicles hundreds of yards downstream, but the DUKW's design allowed them to successfully drive up any reasonable slope, meaning they could establish a bridgehead wherever they landed, scattering the point of attack. Within an hour, the first wave was across. German defenders, expecting the sound of vulnerable assault boats returning for a second wave, were instead greeted only by the fading echo of the bombardment and the noise of machine gun fire from their rear. The DUKWs had simply driven straight up the eastern banks and vanished into the darkness, depositing troops who immediately began engaging German positions from unexpected inland directions. As dawn broke, the horrifying reality began to register in German headquarters. Command posts received reports that seemed impossible. Allied troops were appearing miles inland in full battalion strength, supported by heavy weapons and supplies. The anticipated gradual expansion of a vulnerable beachhead never happened. Allied forces seemed to be everywhere at once. A German battery commander's urgent report summarized the breakdown. Enemy armor is behind us. Repeat, enemy armor is behind our position. All bridges are destroyed. How did they get across? We have seen no pontoon construction. The armor they reported was in reality DUKWs carrying infantry support guns and ammunition that had driven 3 miles inland, bypassing the entire German river defense structure. By 800 hours on March 24th, hundreds of DUKWs were streaming across the Rhine in an unending, continuous line along a 22-mile front. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, an operations officer, later lamented in his war diary, "The enemy has deployed a type of amphibious vehicle in numbers we never anticipated. Our defensive plan assumed 6 to 8 crossing points we could target with concentrated fire. Instead, they're crossing everywhere. Our guns cannot engage so many targets simultaneously." Within hours, 3 full Allied divisions had been transferred across the Rhine with all their associated support equipment. The climax of the logistical and tactical brilliance came at 1,000 hours with the synchronized launch of Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation of the war, dropping 16,000 paratroopers and glider troops just 6 miles from the river. German commanders, caught completely off guard, were forced to shift their already thin resources to engage the troops falling from the sky. Meanwhile, the DUKWs became the logistical backbone for the airborne assault, driving ammunition and medical supplies directly to the landing zones and immediately evacuating wounded paratroopers back across the river, a support capability previously unheard of for airborne operations. The psychological impact on the German line was devastating. A German private's sentiment captured the collapse. "They have unlimited vehicles that swim. How do you stop an army that can turn any river into a road? We blow up bridges for nothing. They don't need bridges." By noon on March 24th, the German High Command realized the entirety of their defensive plan had been rendered worthless. The DUKWs eliminated the vulnerable, sequential steps of a traditional river crossing. Logistics officer Lieutenant Colonel George Sims established continuous DUKW highways across the Rhine. Supplies were simply driven into the river, motored across, and delivered directly to combat units without any time-consuming exposed transshipment or bridge construction. General Eisenhower, observing the operation, remarked to General Bradley, "With these things, every river in Germany is now a highway." The core of this strategic defeat lay in industrial asymmetry. German engineers had in fact developed their own amphibious vehicle, the Landwasserschlepper, or LWS. It was an excellent piece of tracked engineering, arguably superior to the DUKW in rough terrain, but it was designed under the German philosophy of Wunderwaffen, a highly complex, resource-intensive, and custom-built weapon. Germany only managed to produce about 100 LWS units in total, each requiring specialized components and costing 7 times that of a DUKW. In contrast, General Motors produced 21,147 DUKWs using standardized interchangeable GMC trucks. Any mechanic familiar with the standard GMC truck could maintain a DUKW, and spare parts were universally available. This industrial philosophy, mass production for the average soldier, meant that Allied forces always had more vehicles and the overwhelming majority of them were operational. The final human toll was a testament to the DUKW's efficiency. In just 72 hours, the DUKWs completed over 5,000 crossings, moving 15,000 troops, 1,200 vehicles, and over 3,000 tons of supplies. This level of logistical throughput would have required 2 weeks of traditional high-casualty bridge building. German casualties were catastrophic, with the 1st Parachute Army annihilated and 16,000 prisoners captured in the first 3 days. The DUKWs accelerated the end of the war by an estimated 3 weeks. General Omar Bradley later calculated the lives saved. "If we'd have had to cross the Rhine the traditional way, we'd have lost 50,000 men minimum." The DUKWs turned what should have been a bloodbath into a transportation exercise. The DUKW was more than just a truck that swam. It was a technological solution that turned a continental barrier into a logistical artery. It proved that in the total wars of the 20th century, victory belonged not to the military that perfected a design, but to the industry that could mass produce one effectively. The German defenders, blinded by their own preconceptions, never knew the Americans had amphibious trucks to cross the Rhine, and that conceptual blindness doomed their last stand.